we need to make sure we keep looking at every week who our best players are and who are the ones making plays. And then we ask ourselves as coaches, are we putting those guys in those best situations?
In this episode of the Coach and Coordinator Podcast, The Season, presented by Vertical Raise, we speak with Aaron Bohl, the defensive coordinator at Wyoming, about mid-season self-scouting and techniques. We discuss the importance of evaluating player performances beyond the basic statistics and adjusting for coaching tendencies to enhance game planning. Coach Bohl shares his strategy for prioritizing game film, ensuring focused preparation while avoiding information overload. Stay tuned for Winning Edge takeaways following the episode, and be sure to check out our partner Vertical Raise. Elevate your program's online fundraising to new heights. Use Vertical Raise online fundraising system and raise more money in less time. Check the show notes for a link to get in touch with your Vertical Raise fundraising coach. On today's episode of Coaching Coordinator The Season, we focus on things that are pertinent to mid-season, especially in terms of self-scouting. And joining me to discuss that is the defensive coordinator and linebackers coach at Wyoming, Aaron Bohl. Aaron, I appreciate you joining me here on the podcast.
No, thank you for having me.
So, Aaron, we're going to dig into this right away. Hit in the middle of the year, we've got a good set of data behind us as far as what we're doing. Certainly now when we look at opponents, we can figure out what their identity is and what they like to do more so than when we were doing things at the beginning of the year, especially early season, maybe even having to speculate a little bit. But now that self-scout turns into things that we can utilize to help us become better and help us focus not only what we're doing in the game plan, but what we're doing in practice. So we'd love to hear just your philosophy overall on your approach to self-scout.
I mean, that's a great question, a great talking point that's so vital. I really look at self-scout in two different categories. The first thing you're going to do, well, we'll start off what I believe is the most important part of any defense, is you got to figure out who you are and what your players are doing well. So it's important to comb back through, figure out who's making plays, figure out who's good at rushing the passer, and figure out who's good in man coverage, because everyone has a feel in fall camp and spring ball of how they think guys are going to be doing. And then you get out there with the lights on, and we've all been in those situations where guys either surprise us, good or bad. Guys we think are going to do great don't end up as good, and guys that we don't think much of end up, really playing well. And so when we look at our self-scout, even before we get to schematics, even before we get to tendencies, anything like that, we need to make sure we keep looking at every week who our best players are and who are the ones making plays. And then we ask ourselves as coaches, are we putting those guys in those best situations? Even though, hey, maybe they're a team that you got really good beat that they always slide to the boundary, but your best rushers, your field linebacker, well, that still overrides the schematics. Like, hey, we got to find a way to still rush this guy as the game goes and see if we can win those matchups. And that is something, in my opinion, for us as coaches, and I'm as guilty of it as anyone, you get lost so much because you're always thinking about the next game. You're always thinking about, oh, hey, if we just fit this up perfectly, we want to have the best call possible and everything like that. And then you lose the fact of what guys are doing well. How can we use them each week week in and week out? As we talk about later, as we get into like opponent scout, that's one of the biggest things we'll discuss right away is, where do they have advantages over us personnel-wise, and where do we have advantages over them? And that will help structure our game plan each week. But in order to do that, you got to figure out what your players are doing well. The second part of our self-scout we'll look at is, I always laugh, it's the most humbling part, but the importance of being aware of your tendencies as a coordinator on both sides of the ball, and everyone has them, no matter how much you think you do. And so it's important for us to look at a couple situations that we know the offenses are going to look at in particular, like, hey, 0 and 10, like first play of a possession, what's our tendency on third down? When do we start blitzing versus what line does that happen at? And then also we kind of start looking, when in the red zone do we switch our philosophy? What yard line has that kind of been at and stuff like that? And then the last situation that I need to do a better job looking at, that I know for us as a defense has been telling in the past, has been getting the second and long situations. Because it's always, you're either going to be one or two categories. Either you're going to want to be aggressive, keep them out of third and medium and third and short, or you're going to want to be, hey, we got to be on six, don't let a big play. And you just got to know what your tendencies are and be able to have confidence to adjust those during the season, or at least know what you're going to get from the offense. And the great example of that, in my opinion, is for us here, we played a lot of match coverages, man coverages for a while. And when we look at our self-scout, it doesn't mean, all right, obviously the offense knows we're going to play a lot of those types of coverages. Well, it doesn't mean we can't run those, but we need to be aware of what we're going to get and make sure our players are ready to be like, hey, they know on second down we're going to play more man. You guys got to be ready for these pick threats. You guys got to be ready for this, and be able to equip them with the adjustments we know we're going to get thrown at us.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to chew on there. So a couple follow-up questions. The self-scout is important, and I think when you look at it in the week is important. Where does that happen in your workflow of approaching each week of getting ready for the next opponent?
Well, and I think it falls into both the categories we just talked. The first one about, hey, evaluating your players. For us, that's going to be after the game on Sunday. And, even before we dive into the next week, really evaluating our talent again. Coming back through on that Sunday of who's making plays, who's missing plays, and do we need to do something to adjust off that? And so that's going to be the first thing we do even before we really dive into the opponent. And then the schematic side of it, your tendencies and everything like that, I see those usually as that's a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday project. So we don't want to, in my opinion, we don't want to base our game plan off our own tendencies, but it's something as a coordinator you need to be aware of, all right, I know they're going to see this, so hey, maybe on the second line I need to switch it up every once in a while. But we don't want that to be the basis of our schematic game plan.
Yeah, in terms of your tendencies, and I think on both sides of the ball, we look for the break points. When do people change, right? On the offensive side of the ball, for example, when is somebody going to start taking shots, right? When do they look to run certain concepts on the defensive side? Like you mentioned, when do you change to a different mentality? So you become aware of those break points of your own. I think knowing is the important part, because you said, and we'll get into practice in a little bit, hey, we got to work some of these things because we're still going to call this. But how much comes into play of thinking about trying to break those tendencies, maybe changing up what you do in certain areas? How do you weigh, we're good at it, so we're going to stick with it, versus, hey, we're a little bit vulnerable when we do this because we have a strong tendency for it?
Yeah, that is a great question. That's one that you go back and forth with forever. In my opinion, we've had the same conversations. I wish I gave you a better answer. Part of it, I think, is find situations, I think, you do need to break those sometimes to make sure your players are in the best situation possible. And I look at it as all right, hey, find weeks that I'm trying to that, even though you're best at doing this cover, you're best at running cover 6 or whatever, and that's what you really like, or really good at this blitz or this movement, find a week where you changing that up on 1st and 10 or on 3rd down isn't going to be as detrimental. Hey, you know what? We know we're going to play a lot of zone out coverage this week because they have a hard time throwing the ball to the field, so we'll be all right. And every once in a while, we'll just throw it in there to make sure we keep some people on their toes at least for the rest of the year. So in my opinion, you have to look at it as where do their advantages not affect you changing up your call? Because the last thing you want to do is switch up a call just to break a tendency, but knowing it's going to play into their offensive hands.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think you do have those. And it's not necessarily just this is a weaker opponent, so we can flip things up this week. I think it's what you said, they're not as good as this, so it allows us to do this, right? So some of those things definitely come into play and help you along the way because it's going to be charted, right? So I think that's a huge part of it. Now, getting into a little bit of thinking about the breakdowns, right? I think this is important, moving beyond the self-scout and looking at your opponent. As the season wears on, there's more and more film available. And I think back to coaching high school days where, and this is really dating me, Aaron, you're meeting a coach in a parking lot somewhere with a stack of VHS tapes. Usually it's 3. And I mean, that's what you have for the breakdown. And back in those days, there were no systems. You're breaking it down with pen and paper, maybe putting it into an Excel sheet. So you were limited there. Now, even at the high school level, with the way exchanges work in a lot of the high school conferences, you could pull any of the video out. So now you have this whole library, but how much do you really want to focus on?
No doubt. What we do is we are going to look at it, and the first things we do on Sunday, our graduate assistants give me just a sheet, and all it has is every game they've played this year, the opponent, the score, and then the opponent they played, what structurally we're getting front-wise and covered-wise most of the time. Obviously, you get a little bit of both. But just give me the general idea. Hey, generally, they're going to be a 4-down middle field close team. Okay. Generally, they're going to be a 3-down quarters team. I just want the general idea. Obviously, like I said, everyone does everything, but what we're going to see mostly when we watch the game. And when I look at that sheet, and the only other thing they note on that sheet is if major players are out, like if a quarterback misses 2 games, I want that noted on the sheet too, because obviously that takes into account. But off that sheet, I'll usually pick somewhere right about 5 games. Sometimes you'll go up to 6, sometimes you go down to 4, based off teams that fit our mold of what we know they're going to be looking at tape on. Like when they see Wyoming, they know we're going to be a middle field closed team more often than not, and know that we're going to be 4 down front. And so we're going to look for teams in that structure, and if we can't find enough of that, we'll go front first. So like, hey, let's find the 4 down teams first, and then we'll piece together coverage as we go. But that's how we just start our breakdown games to base everything off of. So we'll get around that 4 to 5 game mark.
Yeah, I think the important thing is too much information is going to paralyze your decision making as a coach. We always talk about keeping our players fast and keeping them thinking. Like we don't want to paralyze ourselves in our thought process either.
No doubt. You're exactly right. And the way I've kind of found, and I've settled on how we do things here at Wyoming, is because obviously on the flip side, you don't want to be unprepared. It's like that fine line you're towing. So what I've done is Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, we got our main breakdown games, everything like that. And then after we get our main game plans done, I'll kind of spend time on my own Wednesday, Thursday, and I'll just go through all the other games. And all I'll do outside of watching tendencies and stuff like that, if they hold up, I will just clip problem plays I see for us. Not saying that we'll need to change anything, but hey, on Tuesday night I'm watching, all right, hey, this formation, we got to make sure we discuss this tomorrow morning. All right, this pass route we saw in game 2, even though it wasn't our breakdown, would this fit how we're doing things? And then we'll just meet as a staff and be like, all right, here's our game plan. Here's our rules that we've already decided based off the most likely games we're going to see. And what we're going to do then is, do we have to change any rules, or do our rules still at least apply to these? Where we're not going to be giving up a big play or at least having someone running free down the middle of the field. But that's how we've kind of tried to find that balance of not over game planning on games, but still hitting all of them to make sure you're not going to be blowing something during the game.
Looking then at how both of those things evolve into a practice plan. So your self-scout and evaluation of your players, knowing who your best guys are, looking at how you stop their best stuff, and then looking at problem plays. I think 3 aspects of it. Along with mid-season, there's still a lot of guys we're trying to develop, either for later in the season or down the line, working all that into a practice plan. What's the approach of how you're going to work all this together as you hit the practice field and meeting rooms?
Yeah, something that we see as very important is, luckily here our head coach does a great job giving us a lot of time to work different sets, different drills and everything like that in practice. And so we've been able to at least still hit a lot of indie team sets. I know some people don't during the year as much, but the philosophy we've used with that is just first off, when we're playing the opponent, we make sure we try to get as many different walkthrough plays as we do practice plays. We don't like to overlap a lot to give our guys different feels. And then as we go Monday, we kind of get their base, like, hey, who are they? Who are the generic things we're going to see? Tuesday, we don't like to do too much exotic stuff because that's our first padded day. That's going to be the really physical stuff, make sure our techniques are sharp, everything like that. And so we're still doing some pretty base calls on our end. We're still doing some more advanced stuff on the offensive end, but still nothing too complex yet. And then Wednesday, Thursday, when we're more lightening the load in terms of physicality at practice, as we're getting ready to go into the week and we're lightening the load of running our players, that's when we get to more of the mental challenges, we'd say. That's when we joke about giving them the tough stuff we say in practice. So that's never, that's when we get a lot of these shift trade motions, different, really hard pass concepts we hadn't seen yet and stuff like that. Whenever we're kind of switch the focus from technique-based to schematic-based of the last couple of days.
In the approach then to developing those guys down the line, guys maybe who don't have a role yet, obviously maybe they will later this season, or maybe they're just guys who you need to develop for the next year. What's the approach to making sure those guys stay engaged, stay focused, and do what they need to do to get better? Yeah,
that is the toughest part, is how you handle those guys for sure. Because you got to understand as a coach, at the beginning of the year, everyone's excited. All the players are, even if you're the backup or third string guy, you're excited for your reps and whatnot. We get about weeks 5, 6, 7, and then all of a sudden now they're feeling, all right, is this really worth it? Okay, am I going to be able to make it? And I think it's important, first off, that you just have communication with those guys, the importance of them still buying into the picture. Individual meetings with those backups that you know you're going to need, that they don't know that yet. And then make sure, for us in practice, we split the 1 and 2 reps equally in the season, because we know everyone could be called up at different times. And so it's not like they're sitting over there too much. If anything, we actually have given them some of the harder stuff in practice to make sure they feel an edge going out there, like, hey, no, this is going to be a tough day. I got to make sure I'm on my A game too. And then something I've tried to do, I'm obviously not perfect at it by any stretch, but I've tried my best to always get backups in the game. At least sometimes it's not more than 10 plays, but at least sometimes it's 3 or 4. But give them a taste that, hey, if you're doing stuff right in practice, there will be a role for you in the game on the field. And it's sometimes tough for you as a coach to be like, okay, we're going to do this with the guy. But you got to be able to trust him enough, even though he hasn't done it. Just find a couple plays before the second quarter or something like that. Just show them that, hey, it's worth it what you're doing, putting it in practice each week.
And then the last part you mentioned already was for you picking out and putting together a playlist of those problem plays. Maybe things that don't come up a lot, maybe things that aren't part of what they normally do. Where do you fit that into bringing that to your players' awareness and making sure they get a look at those things?
Yeah, with those problem plays that pop up every once in a while that you might see 4 weeks before and stuff like that, what we've tried to do is put it in a walkthrough early on a Tuesday or Wednesday. And as coaches, sometimes we won't even address it with them before the walkthrough happens, just because we don't see how they handle it naturally. And if there's a good base understanding of their rules, how they should be playing this stuff anyways. Because one thing almost guaranteed on those problem plays is, if it hasn't shown up for a couple of weeks, you're probably not going to get it, but you're probably going to get a slight adjustment that's like it. And you got to make sure the guys are ready for that and have a good understanding of their rules. And then if there is a not confidence on the players, then that's, yeah, you're right, I don't really understand that rule. I don't really understand the set, or how are we going to handle this route? Then we'll revisit it in practice, make sure we discuss it more in the meetings and everything like that. But we almost try to install confidence in them, in my opinion, with some of those different sets, different plays and stuff like that. When you hit in a walkthrough without covering it and they get it right, of like, yeah, I'm ready for anything. This is a weird set, and we didn't even discuss it. And hey, I followed my rules, and we were able to knock it out of the park. So that's how we've kind of looked at it a bit. We don't want to waste as many physical reps on that, on the stuff that they don't do too often, like physical running, everything like that reps. But it's still important to give your guys some confidence in that.
Coach, I appreciate you giving us a look at some of the things that you do and how you think about the self-scout, preparing your players, especially as we hit the middle of the season. And best of luck to you and the Cowboys the rest of the way.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Here are the Winning Edge takeaways and ideas for implementation. We have 2 here based on our conversation with Coach Bohl. The first is to be constantly evaluating player performance. You have to continuously assess who your best players are and what they do well, and then adjust your game plans to put them in the best possible positions to succeed. Coach Bohl emphasized that even mid-season, coaches should revisit the evaluation weekly to ensure that your players are utilized on their strengths, not just on some of their preseason expectations. And the second is to identify and adjust your tendencies. Every team will develop tendencies over the course of the season, and Coach Bohl suggests regularly reviewing those to understand how opponents will plan against them. This allows you to adjust your strategies when necessary to make sure that you remain unpredictable and effective without having to overhaul what's been successful for you. If you are enjoying the podcast, please go to your favorite app and rate and review. It helps other coaches find the podcast and helps our game. Be sure to check out our sponsors. They're listed in the show notes and in the 10% Toolkit. These are companies that we believe in, and they also provide some great benefits to you as the listener. So check those out in the 10% Toolkit. The list is in the show notes. Be sure to check out our new episode each week, the Coach and Coordinator National Coach of the Week, presented by Modern Football Technology. That'll be out every single Wednesday, and we'll be highlighting some of the great high school coaches from around the country. Follow all we're doing at coachandcoordinator.com and follow us on X at Coach K. Grabowski.